Good evening. Welcome to all of you. I'm Pastor Tim Westermeyer, one of the pastors at St. Philip the Deacon Lutheran Church here in Plymouth. And on behalf of St. Philip the Deacon and Mount Olivet, which jointly present this lecture series, it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you here tonight. Just a quick word about the flow of the evening. After we hear from our speaker, there will be a chance for you to ask some questions directly of him through an open microphone. So I encourage you, as you're listening to his talk, to be thinking about things you'd like to ask him. Those discussions are often very interesting and informative, so please do feel free to ask questions when we get to that point. The Faith and Life lecture series, for those of you who have been here before, are opportunities for us to gather and hear people talk about how Christian faith is connected to different dimensions of everyday life. For a number of years now, we've been thinking about finding a way to have a speaker come in and talk about some dimension of the military, and we've thought about different options, and we settled on tonight's speaker. And at this point in my short introduction, I would actually introduce him. However, I'm going to turn the mic over tonight to a friend of his, someone who is a cadet at West Point under him, and a friend of the series as well. Steve Carter retired from the Army Reserves as a colonel. And Steve, if you'd like to introduce our speaker, please welcome him.
So Tim asked me to do this, so I have about 15-20 minutes, and So I first met Chaplain Dick Camp as a freshman at West Point. That first year is known affectionately the first summer as Beast Barracks, and the upperclassmen have a propensity to develop your character about an inch from your face. And so the first time I met Chaplain Camp was he would have church services on Wednesday evening out on a place called Trophy Point, beautiful place overlooking West Point and the Hudson River. And the best thing was he wasn't yelling at us. And he was giving us cookies. So there was all kinds of enticement to be there. I also saw him riding a motorcycle around the campus. I said, wait a minute, chaplains can't be cool, can they? And he was and still is. And so that was a role model for me. He led the Fellowship of Christian Athletes at West Point. I played football there, and so Dick would be our mentor on Friday nights before the games. We play on Saturday. And he'd give us some spiritual encouragement and devotions. And we would need those because we were playing teams like Penn State, Notre Dame, Baylor, Pittsburgh, North Carolina, Stanford. As an offensive tackle, I got to block Mike Singletary, Lawrence Taylor. And boy, did I make them look good. So I needed Chaplain Camp's help. Dick's lovely wife, Regine, is here tonight. And in addition to raising their own 3 kids, she's the virtual mother to hundreds of cadets who she was involved with over the 22-plus years they were at West Point. And speaking of wives, after I graduated from West Point, went off and did some time in the Army, and then went back and served on the staff and faculty, Dick married my wife, Amanda, and me. And I was an old guy when I got married, and so I was still a little nervous about this marriage thing. And I remember sitting there before the ceremony, he pulled out under his robe advertising from Pepsi at the time in the early 90s. It said, "You got the right one, baby." So he said, "Steve, you got the right one, baby." He was right. More recently, I served with him on the Christian ministry in the national parks, where he was the executive director, and he dynamically and passionately led that ministry and has recently retired from that. He's worked with top world leaders, presidents, generals, Coach K, Coach Krzyzewski, who's now at Duke, was at Army when we were there, close friend of Dick's. And he's personally influenced and led thousands of individuals, both religiously and as a mentor, leading them to Christ and leading them in life. You can read in your pamphlet other things, specifics about Dick, but one thing that's not in there, a couple things are not in there. He was recruited by a coach at West Point named Vince Lombardi and decided not to go. He went to Wheaton College in Illinois and was an All-American fullback there. So he was a star athlete as a young guy. And you won't believe it when you see him, but he's over 70 years old now. And he's still one of the fastest Americans. He runs in the Masters track meets, and he was number 3 in the country as recently as last spring in the 200-meter dash. So he can chase you down if you say anything bad. Anyway, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce a leader, a coach, a mentor, a pastor, and most importantly, a friend, Chaplain Dick Camp.
Oh, I just want to see if you can react under pressure.
In the pre-dawn hours of March 4th, 2002, an Army Chinook helicopter, now a Chinook is as big as a school bus with two big propellers on top. An Army Chinook helicopter was maneuvering to land on a snow-covered mountain in eastern Afghanistan. Aboard was a platoon of Army Rangers, elite Army Rangers, sent to rescue a colleague, a downed Navy SEAL. Now, a SEAL is like an Army Ranger, only in the Navy. He had fallen out of a helicopter in enemy territory just 2 hours before. Unknown to the Rangers, they were heading for a deadly ambush by a well-armed cadre of Afghanistan Taliban Al-Qaeda fighters. This army assault was led by Captain Nate Self, a 2008 graduate of the United States Military Academy. And the next 15 hours of battle would be the defining moments in Captain Self's Army career. Before the helicopter even touched this snow-covered 10,000-foot peak, it was hit severely damaged by a rocket-propelled grenade. The helicopter falls with a queasy rush. In an instant, nearly 50,000 pounds of rubber, steel, and human flesh crash to the snow-covered earth. Captain Self later recalled that the night before this mission, he and a few other Rangers were having a Bible study. The theme of that Bible study was Psalm 121. I lift mine eyes to the mountains. From whence comes my help? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He said, I learned that from my chaplain back at West Point. In those fearful pre-dawn moments, those thoughts rushed back to Captain Self's mind and experience. In those incredibly tense hours, Captain Self lost 7 men in the battle. Several others were wounded, including the captain himself. For his leadership in the battle, he earned the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart. His story was highlighted in the media, and as a result of his actions in Afghanistan, he was the guest of President Bush at the 2003 inaugural State of the Union speech. He sat up with Mrs. Bush in the balcony. His book, Two Wars, is an inspiring account of that battle and also the battle in his mind when he left combat to go back home. Nate represents hundreds of cadets with whom I had the privilege to work, who are now in leadership in all echelons of the Army. For more than 22 years, it was my great pleasure to be involved in the leadership at this prestigious, we might call it the nation's predominant leadership training institution. For 22 classes of cadets, it was my duty to stand before them and say, lift up your eyes to the hills. Where does your help come from? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth.